Further ado, I would like to introduce our first guest speaker. He's a professor of security studies at Nanyang Technology University in Singapore. He received his master's from the University of Notre Dame in the US and his doctorate from the University of St. Andrews in the UK. He's also a former senior fellow at the Combating Terrorism Center at the United States Military Academy. He was invited to testify on the structure of Al-Qaeda before the 9/11 Commission. He's also a trainer for national security agencies, law enforcement authorities, and military counterterrorism units around the world. He has interviewed terrorists and insurgents of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and many other conflict zones. In Sri Lanka, he interviewed the LTTE leadership, including Velupillai Prabhakaran, and both the leaders and members of the Islamic State in Sri Lanka as well. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Rohan Gunaratna.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sri Lanka defeated the first insurgency and terrorist group in the early 21st century. And Sri Lanka was able to sustain that victory because it built a state-of-the-art security and intelligence platform in the Northeast. And as a result of that, Sri Lanka was able to detect 14 attempts at revival. And these 14 attempts were all spearheaded, were funded, supported, instigated, and directed from support networks outside Sri Lanka. So you can see very much the relationship between what happens in Sri Lanka and what happens overseas. If you look at the Sri Lankan Tamil insurgency and terrorist campaign, there were 60 officers of the Tamil Tigers located around the world, in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, in continental Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, and in Malaysia. So we saw that these officers engaged in propaganda, fundraising, procurement, and also shipping arms, ammunition, and other equipment. So the international network of the Tamil Tigers remained intact even after the LTTE was defeated on the ground in Sri Lanka. What is vital today is for the Sri Lankan government to keep a very sharp eye on those organizations overseas. There was a time where many of these organizations were proscribed. They were designated under the UN Security Council Resolution 1373. And some of these organizations were delisted. And it is so important today for us to relist those organizations. If we redesignate those organizations, their activities, especially in Geneva, where they will present their own versions, which are often not truths, but half-truths of what happened. And I believe that the Sri Lankan government should develop a very strong foreign policy strategy, a communication strategy, working with Sri Lankan missions overseas and Sri Lanka associations. If we do not do that, the long-term threat posed by the LTTE network overseas will continue to affect us. So this is one of the major considerations in maintaining the national security of our nation. The second aspect that I want to discuss with you is a more recent threat that has manifested after the Easter Sunday attacks. We saw last year in April, a terrorist group that called itself the Islamic State mounted a devastating terrorist attack. And this is one of the worst terrorist attacks we have seen outside Iraq and Syria. And if you look at this particular attack that took place, in Sri Lanka, where they attacked 3 hotels, 3 churches, and a number of other targets. This attack has long-term consequences. And I want to focus a little bit into the genesis of that new wave of terrorism that we witnessed in April of last year. It is based on my own interviews with the members of these organizations that are currently in detention. There are 3 elements to the rise of the Islamic State in Sri Lanka. And of course, the culmination point was the Easter Sunday attack. But how did that extremist ideology arrive in Sri Lanka? It came to Sri Lanka in the 1970s when Sri Lanka opened up, had an open economy, 1978-79 period. We saw that traditionally, Sri Lanka practiced a very beautiful form of Islam. The Sri Lankan Muslim heritage, the foundation of it was Sufism, a very syncretic form of Islam that has existed in Asia for a long, long time. And it coexisted with Buddhism, Hinduism, and even Christianity. But in the 1970s, late 1970s, we saw from the Middle East, an ideology called Wahhabism entered Sri Lanka. And this Wahhabism gradually supplanted that local and traditional Islam that we had witnessed for generations. And what we noticed was that this particular ideology called Wahhabism advocated 2 things. One is a concept called al-wala wal-bara, that is, do not associate with non-Muslims. And the second aspect is that you should break any statues. And that is why we saw the terrorist group that mounted the Easter Sunday attacks. Before that, they attacked Hindu, Christian, and Buddhist statues, the Buddhist statues in Mavanella. So what should be the government's strategy to address this? One is that the government should build a very close relationship with the Muslim community, should build a very strong bond with the Muslim institutions, with the mosques, with the madrasas, with the Islamic associations, and those who run the Islamic media websites, and to ensure that those exclusivist, extremist, and terrorist ideologies do not come to Sri Lanka. Government also should have a list of preachers. This is called the blacklist of preachers, preachers who preach hatred, who enter Sri Lanka and spoil the minds of the young Sri Lankans. Government also should enact 3 important laws. One is a Harmony Act that makes it mandatory upon all religious institutions to invest in harmony, whether they are Muslims, whether they are Hindus, whether they are Christians, or whether they are Buddhists. If we do not do that, certainly those exclusivist and extremist ideologies will manifest. Those ideologies will crystallize in the form of terrorism. So we need the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act enacted. This is one. The second law is we need act to regulate what is being placed in the online space. That is, we need to criminalize fake news, what you call online falsehoods and manipulation, because a lot of the radicalization is taking place online. This is not only Muslim groups, but this is also Buddhist groups that preach hatred. So it is so important for all religions to be covered so that no religious leader engages in ridiculing or in attacking any religion. And this must be very strictly enforced. And those who violate these laws should be punished, including their assets should be frozen. Because if we do not maintain religious harmony, if we do not maintain the ethnic and religious stability of our nation, we cannot have economic prosperity. economic prosperity very much depends on security. That is why the security and intelligence platform is the #1 platform. #2 is the social harmony platform, and that itself will enable investment from Sri Lanka, from overseas, where we can develop our country as a great nation. Let me share with you a third law that is paramount. We have to regulate the schools. Although Zahran's associates have been arrested, the radicalization pipeline that produced Zahran is intact. But for this pipeline to be disrupted, it is very important for government to alter their counterterrorism strategy. Real counterterrorism is not wearing black, carrying guns, breaking down doors and arresting or killing people. Real counterterrorism is monitoring and regulating that religious space, both in the physical space and in cyberspace. That means we should not allow exclusivist and extremist content. This is not only what is disseminated by Muslim groups, but also by Buddhist groups, because we have seen that with radicalization, there was something called reciprocal radicalization. So for there to be true peace and harmony, all communities must work together in this direction. Let me spend a few minutes in my concluding remarks as to the network of Zahran. Zahran's network was extensive. In fact, it originated in 2014 when the first foreign terrorist fighter traveled from Sri Lanka to Syria and Iraq. Then in January of 2015, 30 Sri Lankan foreign fighters traveled to Syria and Iraq. And since then, we have seen that 3 networks emerged in Sri Lanka. One is called the NTJ, the National Tawhid Jamaat. The second group is called JMI, the Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fisilani, largely a Colombo-based network. And the third network emerged in the central province, and that is a student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami organization. In fact, one faction of it, led by the national organizer Sadiq, he created this network, and Zahran unified these networks. And he was able to raise funds, extensive funds within Sri Lanka, limited funds from overseas, and plan and prepare this attack. So Zahran's plan actually failed. It failed because Zahran conducted the Easter Sunday attack to create a riot between the Muslims and the Sinhalese. But fortunately, there was no riot because the Sinhalese and the Tamils were very wise this time. They realized that it is the riots of July 1983 that gave the fuel, that gave the inspiration, that gave the instigation for a 30-year war. So they restrained their emotions. And we saw a brilliant cardinal. The cardinal said to those people who were agitated, if you want to go and kill the innocent Muslims, first attack me. And he said that you will not go to heaven. So in many ways, Cardinal was both Prime Minister and President on Easter Sunday because government was dysfunctional on that day. Let me conclude my presentation by sharing 3 views. One is that without security, there cannot be social harmony. There cannot be economic prosperity. And that means national security is paramount. No country should compromise national security. If any country compromises national security, the threat will grow. Second is that Sri Lanka is today facing a regional threat. That is the terrorist group called the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq has suffered, but it has created a foothold in Afghanistan and it has spread to Pakistan, to India, especially to Kashmir, to Bangladesh, northern Bangladesh, and to Maldives. In the last 4 months, we have seen 3 attacks in the Maldives. And this clearly demonstrates it's a regional threat. And that means the second aspect is that government will have to work together with the regional partners. And the third is that to fight this threat, the relationship with the community is essential. The same way Sri Lanka built a state-of-the-art terrorist rehabilitation program to rehabilitate the Tamil Tigers, 12,000 Tamil Tigers after the end of war, using psychological rehabilitation, creative arts in rehabilitation, social and family rehabilitation, vocational rehabilitation, educational rehabilitation, and religious rehabilitation. We have to have a similar program for those terrorists that have been arrested after the Easter Sunday attack. Similarly, and in parallel, there needs to be a community engagement program and a program to reform the religious space, where there is no space for anyone to preach hatred, because hatred leads to incitement and incitement leads to violence. So I ask all of you to work hard to ensure that there is harmony, there is peace, there is a brilliant relationship between all leaders. And as we speak of the war heroes, I want you to know that Colonel Fazil Lafir, the mentor of our special forces, he should be remembered. And if we remember him appropriately, we should protect the Muslims. Similarly, we have to remember Colonel Nizam Mutalif, the commanding officer of the Military Intelligence Corps. And if we remember him appropriately, we have to protect the innocent Muslims from harm. So that means our spirit must be to ensure that there is harmonious living between communities and no exclusivism, no extremism, and no terrorism once again take root in our country. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gunaratna. I think it's a worth message.